Welcome to part one of a series of short videos that will help beginners to learn how to identify snakes in the western North Carolina bioregion. This is particularly geared for folks like hikers, campers, people who are recreating in the outdoors who don't really know their native snakes, or maybe they're new to the area and don't know what's here, and hopefully will help de-escalate snake encounters and make you a lot more confident and comfortable in the outdoors. First of all, Western North Carolina is a large place, covers a lot of different biological zones. So let's say that Pisgah, Nantahala National Forests, McDowell County, West, Buncombe County, the areas along the Appalachian Trail. That's what we're going to be focusing on. If we get much farther from that area, we start picking up species that we don't normally see here, and this is again aimed for essentially the Asheville general vicinity, the high country, say above 2,500 feet. This is the list of snake species found in this part of the state. It's not very long, only 19 species altogether. If you go down to the coastal plain, especially down to the southeastern corner of the state, the list is close to 40 species. But here we have only 19, and as you can see from the asterisks, a number of those are rare to very, very rare in this area. And so in this series of videos, most of those will not be considered at all because they're seen so rarely here. So the actual number of snakes that you're likely to encounter in this region is actually quite small. So learning how to identify them is not a giant task by any means. Notice that I've separated them out into some natural groupings. The water snakes and their relatives form a fairly large group. King snakes, other harmless snakes here, and then the two venomous species, the copperhead and the timber rattlesnake. The next two videos in this series will focus on these two species. At a minimum, if you can say, walk up to a snake and say, well, it's not a copperhead and it's not a rattlesnake, then it's harmless and you don't need to fear it. So that would be sort of the minimum goal here, is to get everybody to be able to separate these two species from all of these guys over here, and that will go a long way to making you a whole lot more comfortable in the outdoors. And then later videos will address some of these identification for these harmless species over here so that you can add to your knowledge. But the first three videos, this one and the two following, will focus on separating these two species from all this group of harmless species over here. And speaking of the two venomous species, here they are, the only two species of venomous snake in the western half of North Carolina, timber rattlesnake and eastern copperhead. We will have a special video just on copperheads, that's video number 2 in the series, and a special video on timber rattlesnake, that's number 3 in the video series here, and we'll talk more about them, but this is your first introduction to them. There they are. So, since both of those animals are vipers in the family Viperidae, there's some, let's take a little tour. What does it mean to be a viper? Well, in the New World, that would be North and South America, vipers have the ability to sense heat using this little device right here. It's a pit lined with some very special nerve endings, and it is able to detect infrared radiation, i.e. heat. The hole is in the loreal scale, so that's why we call it the loreal pit. But that's the heat sensing device. And New World vipers are called pit vipers because they have that pit. In the Old World, most vipers don't have that pit. There's a few species in Asia that do, but most don't. So that's sort of a New World viper technique primarily. As for any other reptile, we've got a nostril here, which is used for moving air into the mouth cavity as well as for some ability to sense odors, although the tongue is the #1 odor gathering device. The pupils of vipers tend to be elliptical, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. The cat eye appearance of vipers is because of that elliptical pupil. And one other feature on this little tour of the head is this scale, this large scale right over the eye called the supraorbital scale. And you'll notice that it forms a little shelf over the eye, almost like the bill of a baseball cap. And we'll talk more about that later and why that particular scale is of importance to us as we go on through this video. So that's a close-up of a copperhead, of course, and showing you what its head looks like. And you'll notice that it's sitting at a 45-degree angle. Copperheads, when they're in a relaxed position, almost always hold their head at a 45-degree angle. We're not sure why they do that. It may help to accentuate their ability to utilize these senses. It may increase the ability to camouflage, but habitually copperheads and their relatives will hold their head at this 45-degree angle, but notice that the pupil is still vertical. They can rotate their eyes somewhat in the orbit to keep the pupil vertical with the ground surface, which is a trick that most vertebrates can't do. So they're neat animals. Okay. When it comes to identifying snakes, there's all kinds of things out there, some of which are completely false, some of which are true, but not terribly helpful. Here's a couple that are not remarkably helpful, despite the fact that they are true. The pupil shape we've already mentioned. And people say, well, the way to identify a venomous snake is by looking at the pupil. Well, that works great until you find a copperhead with a dilated pupil like this. If you walk up on a copperhead at night, for example, of course, his eye is going to be fully dilated and the pupil will be nearly round. Some will be nearly round even in the daytime. So that's a lot of variation there. And if you get far away from western North Carolina, you start running into venomous snakes like coral snakes that have a round pupil all the time. So that's not a very good feature. Plus, you have to get awfully close to see that. So we don't want to spend too much time talking about pupil size. And even more technical and even less helpful is looking at the scale rows under the tail. If you have to lift the tail of a snake to identify it, you're probably, and if you don't know what it is already, I can guarantee you're already too close. So this is really helpful if you've got a shed skin, for example. If you find a shed skin, the anal plate is usually pretty easy to locate in that shed skin. And if you see a double row of scales, at least in this part of the state, you know that's a harmless snake. And if you see a single row of scales below that anal plate, then that is one of the two viper species. But again, if you get too far from here, that doesn't hold up anymore. So true, but not terribly helpful. Okay. So what do we need to look at? So what we want to focus on in this video is how to look at a snake. People that are unfamiliar with snakes, especially those that are unfamiliar and somewhat fearful, tend to just sort of scattergun. They just sort of look at the entire area and they don't really see the details. So let's see if we can learn how to see those things which are really important for us to notice as we work through an identification to find out what that animal is that we've just encountered on the trail. Okay. The first thing is people always want to take the easy way out. They want one trick. They want one thing. You know, if I see this, then I know X. Unfortunately, there just isn't any such thing in this situation. There's no one single easy to see feature that will allow you to 100% of the time separate vipers, which are our two venomous species, from harmless snakes. There just isn't such a thing. So what we're left with then is we need to consider multiple factors, 2 or 3 or perhaps 4 different items that help us along the way. Well, of course, that's not the easiest way to do it, but it's the most safe way to do it. It's the most accurate and effective way to do it. So that's just the way that's the way we have to approach this endeavor. But it's not that hard. With practice, you're you'll be able to see these different things. You'll develop essentially a gestalt sort of recognition. You'll look at an animal and you don't even know why you know that that's a rat snake or that that's a copperhead, but in your brain you've gone through these features that we're going to learn right now, and you've come up with that identification. And that just takes practice. And I'll encourage you to practice, and I'll show you some different ways to practice these things a little bit later on. But it's not that hard. This is not rocket science. Um, it's very easy to become very proficient with just a little bit of proper guidance and a little bit of effort on your part. Very, very simple. So from this slide onward, then, we're going to focus on those 4 big features which I am presenting to you as the ways to most effectively see snakes and to begin to learn to identify them. All right, first of all, head shape. That's always the big one that people like to talk about. And here's a picture of a timber rattlesnake. From the eastern part of North Carolina. You can see that rusty stripe down the back. We don't normally have that in local timbers, but this one's certainly showing it. And clearly that head is triangular or arrowhead shaped, and this one is even accentuated because you've got these dark patches right here, and your eye is drawn to the light area, which makes it look even more arrowhead or more triangular. So this is a really neat little optical trick they've got going on, which really accentuates that the shape of that head. So it's very easy to run into people who say, "Oh, it's got a triangular head, it's venomous." Well, let's take a look at that. Here's a harmless water snake, a northern water snake. In this picture, we've got someone who's got this water snake. Their hand is right there. The water snake is completely relaxed and not terribly bothered by the presence of that hand there. So then they move their hand and then move it around in front of the snake's nose, and the snake suddenly becomes alarmed. Notice what happens. The head suddenly changes shape. Why does it do that? Well, because he's agitated. Remember, always remember when you're dealing with a snake or pretty much any other animal out there, is that you're a lot bigger than they are. And so you present a potential predator. And so this hand moving in front of that face, this guy thinks maybe he needs to be on the defensive. And so he's going to flare those jaws and flatten this neck and head area and try to look larger, try to look more aggressive, try to look more dangerous as a way to bluff that potential predator. So does this animal have a triangular head? Well, no. But if it's frightened, yes, very much so. Okay. Here's a graphic from Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries, who I used to work for, showing you a copperhead rattlesnake and a rat snake, harmless rat snake, and an alarmed rat snake. That clearly shows that anybody could look at that and say, yeah, all those 3 animals are showing us a triangular head. And over here's a photograph of an eastern garter snake, a very common species here. He's quite alarmed, and his jaws have flared out and relative to his neck size, and he looks triangular as well. So yeah, venomous snakes sometimes have a triangular head. Some species do, I should say. Vipers always do. But then again, many harmless snakes will have that as well. So is that a great way to look at a snake? No, it's just one of the factors, but by itself, it is a miserable way to identify snakes. So you can't really do it, and the reason is because of emotions. They're upset, right? And so they're going to flare, they're going to pose in a very menacing position. This is a harmless gray rat snake, by the way. They're going to flare that jaw. They're going to pose in a position that looks threatening. They're going to do everything they can to try to bluff you as a potential predator. So their emotions play a big role in this, but then so do yours. Remember, especially if you're just beginning and you aren't sure what that snake is, you're not seeing with very clear vision either. In the heat of battle, as they say, pretty much anything would look dangerous and menacing, and you could make a triangular head out of a very completely harmless and docile species. So remember, head shape has got too many factors going on. There's too much variation there. So as a identification trick, it's part of the puzzle, but it's not the only answer. You can't use that solely to make your identification. Real quick biology lesson. The anatomy explains why this is going on. Here's a great photograph that compares two snakes who have approximately equal skull length from the tip of the rostral scale here, or the rostral bone, to the back of the skull, are almost identical. So that's a really nice comparison. This is a rat snake, and this is a viper of some sort. Without more information, I'm not sure what this is, but it's definitely a pit viper of some sort. That's the fangs, that's the reserve fangs that are going to move into place when these break or are lost. Notice that the maxillary bone here, nice and round. Those things fold against the roof of the mouth like a pocket knife when the mouth is closed, and then they fold out to be used when they're attacking prey or defending themselves. And the maxillary bone that mounts that bone is almost perfectly round so that it can rotate in that socket. This is the maxillary bone of this rat snake. Notice that it's elongated, full of nicely recurved teeth, but it does, and it can move in and out this way, but it cannot rotate. So that's the neat adaptation that the vipers have. So we've got two snakes, one a viper, one a harmless rat snake. Skull length is almost identical, but the thing to look at is back here. This is called a quadrate bone. This is the supratemporal bone here. There's a hinge joint there, there's a hinge joint there. Then this bone comes down, and that forms the hinge right there with the lower jaw. And that's the back end of that quadrate bone. That's the back end of that quadrate bone, or that's the back end of the joint. Notice how much longer this is than this. One of the reasons why vipers have such a strongly triangular head is that this bone extends so much further behind the skull. And in non-venomous snakes, that bone tends to be relatively modest. Now, this is not true of all non-venomous snakes, but it's true of many. And this is one reason why the head shape is so exaggerated in vipers. The other thing is that in this region, right about in here, is where the venom gland is stored. And the venom gland of a viper is much larger than the salivary gland. It's a modified salivary gland. So it's much larger than the salivary gland that would be found here in a non-venomous snake. And so there's a little extra material, a little extra mass in that region. And both of those things, especially the bony elements, contribute to the head shape. So that's why vipers have this noteworthy head shape. So vipers, to sum all that up, then vipers do have a triangular or arrowhead shaped head relative to the neck, but by itself that's not going to help us all that much, because many, especially if they're stressed, many non-venomous species will show us that same kind of head profile. So now the next thing, where the eyes are and how the head geometry is affected by that does provide us with some good information, something we can see from a distance that helps us. And a lot of people know this. They already recognize that this is a thing, but they just aren't able to put it in words, perhaps. Or maybe they know there's something going on there, but they've never tried to describe it. So let's try to describe it a little bit. By the way, this is a timber rattlesnake looking right at you. There's the openings of those loreal pits, the heat-sensitive pits. Notice they face forward more or less. And can they see essentially heat? Yes, they can. Their brains can form images using the loreal pit information. And we'll never know for sure, but it's very likely that if you put a pit viper, such as this rattlesnake, in a completely dark room, threw a mouse in there, he would be able to see that mouse using just its heat signature, locate it, see how big it is, see how far away it is, strike it accurately in total darkness. We know they can do that, and it's very likely that they're seeing an image. They're not just detecting it like an odor, they're actually seeing, they're actually creating a visual image in their brain using heat. So that's a really neat thing. Okay. So let's do a comparison. Here we've got a viper. Here we've got a harmless water snake. We're looking down on the head of both of these animals. And remember, I mentioned the supraocular scale in one of the early slides. If we look at this viper head, You can't see its eyes. We're looking straight down on it, but the eyes are hidden. They're underneath that ridge, that supraocular scale. Like I said, makes like a little baseball cap over each eye. And if you look straight down, you can't even see the eye. Notice how sharp that line is. The head is basically flat on the sides. It goes from the edge of these scales, goes straight down. Compare that here. We have a much more rounded head shape. The eyes are visible, even if looking straight down. These guys are prey species, and so they need to be able to look all around and make sure that nothing is approaching them, like a great blue heron getting ready to pick him up out of the water. So their eyes are mounted out, sort of bug out a little bit, almost a comical look, with the eyes clearly visible. No matter how you look at this animal, you're going to see its eyes. You're going to see that the head is relatively narrow here and rounded. Here's the edge of the jaws way out here, and here's the edge of those supraocular scale there. So there's a slope here, not a straight drop off. If we go back to the rattlesnake, notice this just drops straight down from the top of the scale straight down. And so this is an appearance, a geometry that gives vipers' heads a much different looking appearance than the heads of any of the non-venomous snakes, especially in the local area. The whole region here between the eyes and across the snout and even back towards the back end of the head is dead flat. You could sit your coffee cup on there and it wouldn't fall over. I wouldn't want to put my coffee cup there. It's probably not going to be terribly stable. So that flattened region and the sharp edges is something that you can see from quite a distance. It's very obvious, and if you really focus on looking for eyes and looking at how the head overall is the appearance of the geometry of the head, this becomes a very, very obvious and a very reliable assistance. One of these four factors to look at when we're trying to identify snakes. And not to be left out, here's our copperhead. Here's a juvenile copperhead looking straight down. You can barely see the eye right there, just a little tiny smidge. That ocular scale or supraocular scale just about covers it. Here he is from the side. You notice the nice flat area here, nice and wide. The full width of the head is completely flat. You see this nice bulge in the back. That's where that venom gland is stored, and that's the edge of the jaw hinge is about right in there. There's the loreal pit again, very flat, very angular, just a whole lot of flat surface, and that's something that a lot of people recognize, but they just have never tried to describe it before. So maybe with that it would be a little easier for you to say, yeah, okay, I see that now, I recognize that. That's a thing. Color. Sometimes color can be really very helpful. But you don't want to rely on color too heavily as one of our recognition features. But we will talk about color as we go through this series. We'll talk about the colors and because that certainly can be helpful. Here's a picture of two northern water snakes. Here's a nice bright individual. See all kinds of red going on the sides here. Beautiful animal. And over here's another northern water snake. This one's just filthy. It looks to me like maybe it just came out of hibernation or brumation. Snakes don't really hibernate, they brumate, which is a seasonal retreat to avoid cold weather. So it looks like he may have just come out of brumation, and he's still kind of filthy, and and he may be about to shed, which is typical in the early spring, this time of year. It's May, late May when I'm recording this, so snakes are just really beginning. It's been a cool spring, so they're just beginning to get out and move around, and being ready to shed is kind of a thing right now. I see no colors at all. These are both the same species. So color sometimes can help you, but realize that sometimes you're not seeing color. So you don't want to depend on it too much. But while we're looking at this, what ID features can we see on these animals? Okay, well, on this, I see not only color, but I see pattern. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Here, look what I see. I see eyes. bug eyes, comical, sort of looks like, ooh, look at that. He's sort of a kind of quizzical or almost cartoonish. And I see a nice rounded head top. The edges of the jaws way out here. I don't see any flat surfaces on the sides. Everything's nice and round and the eyes stick out. Very different appearance than if that was a viper. So I can see some of the features that we've talked about. Um, even though this guy's filthy, I can still take one look at that and say, okay, nothing to worry about there. It's just a water snake. Again, in the fourth video, that's what as the plan exists now, we'll be talking a little bit about some of the features that would increase your ability to identify this. So, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, is dorsal color pattern. Not the color, but the way the colors are arranged on the body. Pattern is extremely important for most identifications. Here are, again, our two vipers. Here's a copperhead. It's a photograph I made. Someone called me to get a copperhead out from under their hot tub. This is all I could see. That was the whole body. The head and the tail are both hiding under the deck, and this little loop was sticking out. But hourglasses or the Hershey kiss, people describe the pattern of a copperhead both ways. Clearly visible. Didn't take a nanosecond to say, oh, that's a copperhead. And over here, a section of a timber rattlesnake. Maybe that's all you see. You're stepping over some rocks on the trail and you look down and this is all you got. Well, notice these bands, very classic timber rattlesnake pattern with this sort of zigzag or lightning bolt type banding. Clearly you know that's a timber rattlesnake because you are seeing pattern. You're seeing pattern. So as we go through these next few videos, these are the four things we're really going to focus on. Okay, we know that no single feature, no single one of these is going to help us identify every snake we see. We're going to have to look at a number of different things, but we're going to categorize them into these four areas: head shape, eye placement, head geometry, color, and pattern. And of these four, pattern, I always say, is the most important single one to really focus on. That's kind of where we start, and we add these others in, but they're all valuable. And you can do this. This knowledge is going to really help you become more confident and more relaxed when you're in the outdoors. Fear of the unknown is always the worst sort of fear, and knowing what's out there and how to identify it, being confident about it, and knowing all those basic things will certainly reduce your fear level and make hiking and camping and recreating in this area much more enjoyable, especially for those of you who are new to the area or basically unfamiliar with reptiles in general. Okay, but remember that we're focusing here on the western North Carolina bioregion, Pisgah, Nantahala, Buncombe County, Asheville vicinity. If you go very far from here, you're going to start picking up species you aren't seeing here. Remember, for example, as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you go down to the southeastern coastal plain, Wilmington, where I grew up, there's 6 different species of venomous snakes down there. They have copperheads and they've got timber rattlesnakes. They've also got cottonmouth, they've got eastern diamondback, pygmy rattlesnake, and the coral snake. So they've got 6 different ones and close to 40 snake species altogether. So it's a much more complex situation. So don't take these rules or these guidelines that I'm giving you here and think you can go everywhere. And identify. They certainly will help, but they're not going to be the final word. You have to realize that as you move around, different faunas are going to have different species with different features. So again, remember that this is a very focused presentation for folks in this region, and the basic ideas will transfer, but you got to be sensitive to the fact that your local fauna may have species that fall outside the realm of what we're doing with this. So next in the series will be Identification Natural History of the Copperhead, our most commonly encountered venomous species. Timber rattlesnake as the only other venomous species here will be next. Water snakes are always a source of great confusion and concern. People think that any snake in the water must be dangerous, cottonmouth, and they simply don't occur here. So we're going to talk about water snakes, and then we'll pick up their relatives, things like the garter snake, which are water snake relatives. And then some of the larger snakes like rat snakes and king snakes. And so that's at least those 4 more videos will be part of this series. So hopefully that was informative and helpful. If you have, just stay tuned for the rest of the videos in the series, and I will see you on the trails.